Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the focus of today's video are these two bins right here. These bins are now exactly 1 year of age, and it's been 31 days now, pretty much a month, since we originally set up these horizontal migration feeding zones in both bins. And over those 31 days, we've periodically returned to these bins to see how the migration of the worms was doing, because the whole idea of setting up the feeding zone on the edge is to hopefully give the worms incentive to come out of their finished castings and gather in a place where they could be hauled out, and then making the castings in each of the bins available for harvest. And this just happens to be the time of year, summertime, when the humidity in my area goes way up. And as a lot of you already know, when the air is humid, saturated with moisture, things don't dry. Things just stay damp. And that's the same story with these worm bins, kind of like what you see over a little further to the left. Finally, I was able to get the last of the worms out of here, but it took 70 days. So after only 31 days of these systems being given time to dry to the point where hopefully the worms feel motivated to leave the material, 31 days might not really have been enough time. So I'm in here mainly because of the fact that it's a year since these systems were launched. I don't have high hopes for a very good turnout, because the last check-in 1 week ago today showed us that the worms were still out there in the castings, reluctant to leave, probably because the stuff is still nice and damp and cozy for them. But I've got some food and I've got some bedding, and I thought if nothing else, we would at least replenish the food supply, maybe add a little bedding, and see what we could do about, trying to help this process continue. So I'm going to get these up on the bench, and I doubt we're going to be hauling worms out today. In fact, I can guarantee it. Even though I've got material that I built for them, I whipped up a nice big batch of bedding for them 20 days ago. I'm definitely ready with stuff to put them into, but I just feel like we haven't really got a good turnout yet. So let's get them up on the bench and we'll get to work. Before we even look underneath the plastic to see how the feeding zones are coming along, although we can remove the plastic just to get it out of our way, I figured we would check the status of the evacuation of the material. So I thought we would do a little aeration of the finished castings first, and then we can make our way over into the feeding areas. But I'm fairly certain that what we're going to find is just material that still has lots and lots of worms in it. I could tell just from putting my fingers into it how moist the stuff is. My only hope is that by stirring it around a little bit and aerating it, maybe I'm helping slightly to dry the material. But even now, I think a week later, I don't see a whole lot of difference in terms of a reduction in worms in the material over here. And I'm not even certain about how much the aeration helps the material dry. Look at this stuff. It just sticks to my gloves. It clumps together. It's kind of making me wonder if I need to rethink my strategy for separating these worms from their finished castings. Alright, so it is a little bit difficult to do this without accidentally spilling the material over the edge, because I do feel like I'm operating pretty close to the capacity of these containers here. When it came time to set up the horizontal migration feeding zones, everything had to be nudged over to make room for the setup of the fresh bedding and food and everything. One thing I've been doing though elsewhere, in a couple of my other European nightcrawler bins, these are European nightcrawlers by the way, I tried running a fan to just blow across the material, across the top surface. Then I would come back once in a while to stir the material around. I could feel just from a half a day, even after a half a day of the fan blowing across the top, how the material on the surface did actually become a bit drier. So I do believe that the movement of air across the material does promote its drying. And then after that has happened, after a short while, I would stir that somewhat drier material down into the rest of the stuff, and I did that for just a few days, because then I was going to be away for the last weekend, and then I didn't want to just leave that whole setup that way, so I concluded that operation after just a couple days. Although I probably should have set it up again. In fact, I was even thinking that maybe I would leave these bins out on the bench here, because I've got the fan set up overhead, aimed down onto the table over here, and I thought that perhaps I could even position those two other bins that I was doing that fan blowing treatment on out here on the bench with these two systems, and then just let the fan start running again, possibly aiding in the drying of not only the material in these two systems, but those other two systems as well. Then we would have all the European nightcrawler bins out here on the bench, attempting to become a little bit drier, a little bit more manageable. I mean, yeah, the stuff definitely clumps together, but it is kind of nice that it doesn't seem that bad. It seems like it crumbles a little bit. So, before we peek into the feeding zones to see how things are progressing, why don't we just do a quick inspection over here too in bin number 1. So I can definitely feel the material out here on the surface being a little bit drier, but you don't have to go very deep down into the material to start sensing quite a bit more dampness. So yeah, I definitely like the idea of maybe reinstituting the fan blowing on bins setup, and bring those other two bins, which I was doing it to, back out here, and then maybe that would actually start to help things here. Perhaps a few days of the bins getting air blown on them, and then a few periodic stirs of the material might actually help things go in the direction that we want them to. So here it was, I don't know, to me somehow, I think already last time too, we somehow sensed how the material in this bin over here, bin number 1, might be a little bit drier, a little bit more, I don't know, somewhat more manageable in a way. It just feels a little bit more crumbly, a little bit more loose, less likely to clump in my hands, but there's really not a whole lot of difference. But it does also seem to me like perhaps there's somewhat fewer worms in this material. Perhaps giving us a little bit of hope that the migration of the worms out of this stuff can someday come to its conclusion. Alright, so I think we've sufficiently stirred up and aerated the finished castings in both bins. Why don't we see how the migration of the worms over into the feeding area is progressing. I think we noticed it last time too, how the worms had deposited so many nice castings out on the top surface over here. But we found last time that things seemed a little bit dry. So the parting actions last time we were in here was to actually bring out the spray bottle and dampen all the material in here. Not only the stuff that had been in here already, but the newly added stuff, just to make sure that the environment over in the migration zone is such that it's comfortable for the worms, So here's that other piece of cardboard. I sort of took a departure from resetting these little partitions that I use sometimes. Sometimes when they start getting this tattered, I'll swap them out with replacements. But I figured let's just leave them be and use them again as is, regardless of the condition they're in. And that's kind of our game plan here today too. I wasn't going to replace them today. I was just going to hope that they're holding together well enough to be reused. It almost seems to me like maybe this time we've got a somewhat better worm population in here. Last time it seemed like the number of worms in here was, I don't know, I think I referred to the turnout as lackluster. It does seem like the material would also benefit from a bit more dampness if we were to possibly spray it down. So I can always get my squirt bottle at the end and we'll apply a little bit more moisture. I believe that will probably help things a lot. A little bit counterintuitive to even be coming in here with a water bottle to spray, but the material on this side does need to be such that the worms find it favorable to be in and comfortable. It's really just the finished castings that we'd like to see become a little bit more uncomfortable for them to remain in, possibly prompting their movement out of this stuff. So I think that seems like a pretty good arrangement there. We'll try to set things up similarly over here. Last time it just seemed like so few worms had come together. Or maybe they had come over and eaten all the food we put out for them and then they just returned back into the finished castings, perhaps because they found that stuff to be more damp and comfortable to be in. Here too, it feels like this stuff could definitely use a little bit more moisture. Considering I came in here with the water bottle at the end of the last check-in and doused all this stuff pretty thoroughly with moisture, it's a little bit surprising to find that it's getting a little bit dry. Also because of the fact that it's been protected with the plastic coverings so that they wouldn't lose any of their moisture content to evaporation. So it does seem to me like we're getting a pretty decent turnout over here. But it does somehow feel to me like I'd like to have more. I'd like to have a somewhat greater number of worms coming together over here prior to us doing the first haul out. And, you know, I think even in the last few systems, it took quite a while before we could finally do the first haul out of the worms. And I think even the last system where I finally got the last of the worms out of this stuff, it took 70 days. So for us to have only gone 31 days here, perhaps it was just high hopes and wishes that we would be able to bring an end to these systems by this time. But I'm just going to run with it at this point. We're going to just continue as is. And I've got a feeling that perhaps we'll do the same again as we did last time, which is to come in here and not only spray down my freshly rebuilt side of the feeding zone over here to make sure it's nice and damp, but we'll also dampen all this other existing stuff that was in here already. Let's not forget we're doing 2 bins here. Let's get the supply back over here. And then back on with the plastic coverings to help it keep nice and comfortable. And as you can see, we've also increased its overall size in the hopes that it can accommodate a greater number of worms. I'd also hate to think that the reason the worms are not staying in it is because they're sensing overcrowding. So now I'm putting in coffee here. Coffee that's been left to dry pretty much, so it doesn't bring with it a great deal of moisture. And another thing that I often do when I apply coffee is I also bring in my worm chow. Once again, a somewhat dry material. And then the stuff that I believe is going to bring some moisture with it is the assortment of veggies that I bought down here from my freezer. So I'm sort of blending this coffee and worm chow into the underlying bedding material. Somehow it seems to me like the worms will appreciate that. I'm also thinking before we put the foods in, why don't I grab my water bottle and bring it up here. Oops, just spilled my worm chow all over the table. So I got a little bit of cleanup to take care of here. This is very similar to what we did last time, except I think I applied the moisture as sort of an afterthought versus trying to come in here and make sure the entire contents are nice and damp. Perhaps this stuff too would have benefited from me dampening it before I piled it up so high. I don't know, I'm not too worried about it. I think really it's not so much how well we built the feeding zone, because the worms obviously like it and they're hanging out in it. I think it's really more about the material on the other end of the bin, the finished castings, becoming something that the worms don't really want to remain in any longer, prompting their movement out of this stuff and finding the nice little bounty of freshly added bedding and moisture and food that we set up for them. And let's see, the foods, right? Oops, there I go. This time we just knocked over the empty coffee container, so I'm just being awfully klutzy today. And actually, now that I think about it, I did the same exact thing last time we were in here. I remember the water bottle sort of tipping over that way. So what we've got in here is some little bits of lettuce, little bits of cucumber peel. You can already see a whole bunch of the juices that have spilled out of this stuff by it thawing. It's quite warm, even down here in my basement. Usually down here in my basement it's a little bit cooler than up in the house, but even here today, pretty much morning still, it's already getting quite warm. And I don't know, I'm not that big of a air conditioning user. I've got the air conditioning if I really feel desperate to have something, but usually I just tolerate the heat and the humidity with a fan blowing on me, and it seems like it's enough in most cases. So I'm thinking before we cover up here, another thing we could do is just further enhance the size of the feeding zones, and at the same time cover up our newly added foods a little bit with just another little bit of bedding, which we can come back in here and dampen. So we'll get the water bottle out here one last time and give it one last little dousing of moisture, so that what we're creating for these worms is hopefully a really comfortable, cozy spot to be in. And somewhat larger now, almost taking up half of the system. Half of the bin is now, almost half of the bin is now horizontal migration feeding zone. And I think that the last thing I'm going to be doing here is not removing these systems from the bench and just turning the fan on, which is already situated overhead and aiming in this general direction. And then that'll probably, hopefully, promote the drying of the castings. I will be putting the plastic coverings back on, and the plastic coverings will protect the drying of the material over here in the horizontal migration feeding zones. Not only this piece of bubble wrap, but also that somewhat larger plastic bag, big enough to cover up the entire area of the surface. And then here too, just level off a little bit before we cover up. Same treatment, back on with the bubble wrap. Even though the bubble wrap's really not covering much anymore, or even doing much anymore now that we've got this somewhat larger one supplementing it. And the process continues. So at some point soon, hopefully we'll be able to bring an end to these, but I'm not holding my breath. I recognize the fact that it is going to take some time, and that's fine. Whatever, it'll get done when it gets done. So at 1 year of age and after 31 days of migrating, I believe this is feeding number 33. 29 feedings over here, and now feeding number 4 over in the horizontal migration area, hopefully prompting the movement of the worms out of their material. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.